much on our plate. We have some exceptional guests this week. Joe Walter is a friend of the show. He is pursuing a PhD in urban studies. He is a labor historian. And on a personal note, he is an exceptional teacher. I work with him it's always enlightening. We are also Adam Haneke, who's the history. He also teaches a course on film culture. We love the conversations, especially we also have another friend of the show, Monica Drake. She may or may not be participating. She's right now here for moral support. She's not sure, but I think she will join in. And I also have
I took the big plunge.
congratulations. I am a big fan of marriage, and I wish it for everyone. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. The show, as of yet, does not have health I want to start the discussion with a very absurd memory about Henry Kissinger. When the movie The Gladiator came out, Kissinger was asked for whatever reason if he had seen it. He said yes, and he tacked on that it was historically accurate. Now, I want to take 2.5 minutes. Nothing.
Start over.
The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. These opinions, conversations, and quotations do not in any way represent River West Radio. The persons responsible are solely the producer, guests, and people calling in. Consequently, River West Radio is not liable for legal issues arising from the content you are about to hear. Good evening, everyone. You are listening to the Size of Thoughts radio show. I am your host, Randy Miller, filling in for Jacob this week. The topic for tonight is history and film. In the next 55 minutes, we hope to address and analyze the different ways in which history and film come together. How accurately do films portray history and convey information about human reality? Does the medium of film limit or enhance our attempts to represent the human condition? How effective is a movie in the classroom? What is the difference between a movie and a documentary? Or can film itself be a historical artifact? With so much on our plate, we're lucky to have some exceptional guests this week. Joe Walter, who is a friend of the show. He is pursuing a PhD in urban studies. He is also a labor historian. And he is an exceptional teacher. I've worked with him as a TA several times, and it's always enlightening, and I hope to work with him again. We also have Adam O'Conachie. He comes to us from the English department. He does have a strong background in history, but he also teaches a course in film and culture, which is going to be helpful to me, so he can handle some of the more of the film side of the discussions that I'm not familiar with. And of course, Monica Drake, who is also a friend of the show. She will be here. Perhaps right now she's giving us moral support. She might join in. It's up to her. She doesn't have to, but she can.
I'm gonna.
Okay. And Monica, I recently heard that you got married.
Yes, I did.
So-
I just did on June 9th.
Okay. Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
The show does not, as of yet, have a healthcare program. So you'll have to work that out.
Right.
Okay. I wanted to start the discussion with with an absurd memory of Henry Kissinger. When the movie The Gladiator came out, Henry Kissinger was asked if he had seen it for whatever reason. He said yes, and he asserted that it was historically accurate. Now, I would like to take about 2.5 minutes to deconstruct the historicity of The Gladiator, if you would indulge me. I want to do it in a certain way that I hope leads us into the direction I want to go with this conversation in the beginning. In the ancient world, the average male was probably 5'2". Like any culture any pre-modern culture where their life is much closer to nature where there are no unions to protect their bodies. There's no such thing as ergonomics. Their body was oftentimes, if not always, shaped very much by their labor. We see it even today. Perhaps asymmetrical muscle development, crooked back, certain scars, things. My dad laid brick his whole life. His fingers are bent in such a way that they wrap around a brick. Even more so back then, without ergonomics and without medicine and things like that. Their bodies reflected their labor. In The Gladiator, we're given Russell Crowe presented as physically large. He has a booming voice. He shows us all the signs that we would understand as, powerful, in charge, hero quality, things like that. His body, he literally has guns. His body is produced scientifically in a gym, certainly with some supplements. This is a perfect, beautiful body. His arms are symmetrical. Everything is there's nothing like the average Roman would have had at that time. Marcus Aurelius, who appears in the movie, this character, there's no complexity whatsoever. It's simply a character type taken out of a producer's closet and given a toga. There's nothing there that's historical. In the ancient world, there were no antibiotics or medicine. If you outlived your infections and diseases, you bore the marks. There were scars, pockmarks, missing eyes, teeth. Oftentimes in those movies, you will see a token diseased guy. The camera will turn and, hey, look at that guy. He's diseased. Everyone freak out. But that was far more common because of the medicine. The fact is, if we went back to the time that that Gladiator is supposed to be giving to us, if we could be there, we would be horrified at the smell, the disease, the mores. We would see from our perspective what we would consider ugliness and brutishness. We wouldn't understand it. We wouldn't want to be there. So why is the Gladiator not like that? Because a 5'2" asymmetrical pockmarked hero would not make any sense to us, nor would a chubby, short, pockmarked heroine, if you can recall the beautiful actress who played the woman there. We couldn't make sense of a real Roman or a real Roman way of life. What these so-called historical movies really give us is simply a universal and ahistorical characters that have been given special names and special costumes. In The Gladiator, we're given nothing about Roman history. And to me, it seems that once you commit to conveying history in images and symbols like you do in a film, you're automatically constrained by what images will be understood by that audience. And it's more than just Hollywood needing to make money. I think that this distortion has to be there for a film to work. So, after all that, am I just being a curmudgeon? Am I being a snob? Or am I being fair to this medium? What do you think?
It's a large question, obviously. I guess to begin, I just wanted to make two quick points. One is to just remind us that film as a medium is a multifaceted medium with different modes and conventions for those alternate modes. So here you seem to be responding solely to fictional narrative film as opposed to documentaries, experimental films, short films, etc., each of which might represent the same event in a different way than a mainstream Hollywood big budget film would do. And then two, just for us to think about over the course of this discussion, is that, again, if we are comparing fictional narrative film to academic histories, then we should have perhaps an awareness of different goals for each of those forms, right? That academic history is for a precise audience using particular sources and materials, just as fictional narrative film has its own goals in mind. In a film like Gladiator, certainly is probably more concerned with making money and finding an audience than it is with accurately depicting, actual Roman history.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with the genre that is what we would consider the Gladiator as a part of. How would you categorize that?
I suppose if we're just sort of categorizing them in terms of loose genres,
certainly.
Historical fiction, it seems, which
Okay.
is mode across mediums, right? That there's literary historical fiction, just as there's cinematic historical fiction. And as we were talking about in the preparations for this show, we can certainly think of numerous examples with faulty or fabricated history throughout the course of a narrative depicting what is ostensibly a precise time period and event. As you said in Gladiator, even the very bodies are distinct from what they would be otherwise. As you were writing, I was wondering, and this is not my specialty, so this is pure conjecture, but maybe something to consider. In terms of artifacts that we have from the Roman era and their representational artwork, if Gladiator in some way is a representation based on their representations from that era, rather than something that's true to life, it's a response to things that the people of that era represented, how they represent their own bodies through sculptures, etc., mosaics.
So it's mythology.
Right.
Yeah, and I kind of thought about that too. So they can represent something else as a a mythology or something that's more contrived than reality was, of course. And you see this before, films, whether they're documentaries or narrative films, historical films, begin. You see it at, like a symbolic representations in, for instance, like the cave paintings at Lascaux. You have to read the subtext. What do those paintings tell us? They don't tell us exactly what happened back then, but they do tell us something. They tell us that people were hunting. They tell us that they had tools. And they tell us that they were deriving some form of culture that revolved around painting, and understanding their own representation. Equally, you have, for instance, paintings like Hieronymus Bosch's Garden in the Good of...
Earthly Delights.
Yeah, Earthly Delights. Thank you very much. I was going to say in the Garden of Good and Evil. Why was I thinking that? But thank you very much, Adam. So that that's obviously not a painting that reflects reality, but it reflects a consciousness that people had in a historical time period. So
how does that relate to, if we go back to the Gladiator, do we have any base for saying that we can learn something historical by watching that movie about that particular time in Roman history? The body issue thing, I think we know those things because of archaeology and anthropology rather than actual analysis of art. But can we say there's anything anything?
My
was threatening.
history, Randy. Sorry.
Please. Is there a basis to say that anything is historical other than the costumes? Joe?
Well, I think that we need to include costumes in this. I think that it depends upon what it is that the filmmaker has paid the most attention to as far as making it historical. So with the Gladiator story, as we kind of talked about in our preparation for this discussion, we had talked about how they had. The filmmaker had contracted all these archaeologists and historians to kind of reconstruct what the Colosseum would have been like, and what the outer reaches of the Roman Empire might have looked like, what the costumes might have been like. I think that there is a certain amount of historical attention paid to those things. Now, I think that the subtext to this, I think that what you're asking is that what does that do to the things that are not historically accurate, right? And I think it lends a certain amount of credibility to those things, right? That probably shouldn't be ascribed to that. So the love story probably is not historically accurate. The issue of the bodies. I mean, I think that's a fantastic example. And the character of the main character, Russell Crowe's character, name slipping me right now. I think that the possibility of such a person existing becomes more historically, possible. I think that there's a certain amount of projection of historical accuracy on that. And I think that there are some things that can be learned, and I think that it can perhaps be a tool to teach some of this. But I think that for broader audiences, I mean, there might be kind of a mistaken identity here.
But can you
Right.
can you take an authentic uniform, authentic symbols from those cultures and put them on a person and say somehow that becomes historical? It seems like one of the distinctions that came up when we were sort of going over this is that I don't have a problem, I don't think anyone else has a problem with saying that film can accurately depict technology, right? We can, they can go back, but the stuff that we study, the human experience, it's just so far removed. So, I mean, is that a right distinction to make? I mean, does it help us to make that distinction?
Well, I think certainly in mainstream films it is. If we see things, and well, another historically oriented film from the same area that we discussed was Titanic. I think Gladiator and Titanic came out within 5 years of one another. Both large smash successes made by, again, mainstream established filmmakers with huge budgets. And I think both films showed, as Joe began to point out, a preoccupation with historical minutia in favor of actual historical accuracy regarding narrative and characterization and whatnot. But then there's still something interesting then with these films, because the narratives, as patently false as they might be, are still classical narratives in some ways, narratives that recurred across cultures and across time periods, right? Some sort of class-oriented romance, as in Titanic, or a lowered great man who then rebuilds himself and becomes the hero once again. These are recurring conventions in all of human existence, or all of human narratives, we might say. So even if the details are false, there's something that these films. Well, I'm trying to think. The success of these films says something, again, perhaps less about that time period, but about the period in which they're made, which I hope isn't jumping ahead, but we began mentioning film as artifact, and it reveals something about the era in which it was produced.
Right.
And so what is it about, people flocking to see these films, that says something about the early millennium?
Right. Well, one thing that I thought you were going for there, and I think you might have gone for it, and I want to pick up on, I think what you were saying is that there are these reoccurring themes that really resonate with people, these reoccurring stories that seem to be cross-cultural, cross-time, but do real lives get lived like that? And I think later on when we get to that stuff that the history as artifact,
Sure.
I think that will enlighten us quite a bit more on this topic. But I want to stay with the are they giving us anything historical, anything of value as we as historians understand it? A
Sure.
gladiator. And I want to at least get some sort of not an answer, but a conclusion that we can come to. What I put out in the beginning, does that have merit? Do you think there's too many problems? I'm being too hard on it.
No, I think that's true in terms of, again, fictional narrative film, simply because it has different purpose and goal than academic history. Although, if we wanted to give Ridley Scott, the director of Gladiator, the benefit of the doubt, we might say that he is playing on ancient epic narrative conventions with Gladiator. And so taking maybe details of history and exaggerating them to create this, blown up sort of story. But yeah, Joe.
Well, I think that there's two different things going on here. I think, first of all, there's the film itself, right, which has to be, a product that the people are going to sit through and pay money for, right? I think as you pointed out earlier, that's a major component of this. And then the other part of it, which, I think that this genre is kind of fascinating for, is that it kind of taps into an existing desire for reenacting, right? Like there's this by creating this film, by going and participating in this audience to go see this, you are somehow participating in that history. and I think that there's a paradox that's kind of there as well. That there's, if you've ever been to a Civil War reenactment, right? Boy, that's just like there's all kinds of nuts there. Not to offend anybody here, but
Monica is offended.
I already gave a disclaimer.
Well, I think that
I'm the blacksmith's wife. I'm totally offended.
right. Well, and I've participated in reenactments too, 1812ish kind of stuff, and it was just a bizarre experience, right? Because you're there to kind of participate in this. But you're not of this time, and so you're supposed to.
But if I could ask a question quickly, with reenactments, and this is just my impression, some attempt to reenact precise events, whereas others just attempt to recreate an era. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you participated in ones that attempted to recreate a precise battle? And if so, were there certain rules and restrictions you all had to follow in the hopes of creating something authentic? That's a troublesome word for me, but
well, I think that the to reuse that word, the authenticity varies, depends upon what it is that you're there to achieve and the group of people that you're there with. But ultimately, like all reenacting is to reenact and essentially to relive a moment that you cannot possibly relive, right? And so I think that there's something of that going on in this genre, right? This attempt to recreate, to relive this moment, right? That is impossible to achieve. And Randy, I don't know if this is exactly what it is that you're getting at, but I think that I don't know if we're going to find an answer to this here. We might not be able to come to this conclusion.
What do you mean?
Because there's so many, I think there's so many questions surrounding that. First of all, like, what does that mean, right? To want to relive this.
Yeah.
And in any medium, whatever medium you use in order to recreate something historical, there's going to be a bias. You're going to be removed from it. There's gradations, obviously, 30 years or 10 minutes ago. People are always repurposing the past, and they're doing it through their own visual lens. So if it comes through as ridiculous as The Gladiator, obviously they're not promising the audience anything. They're not promising to be factually accurate. They're not promising, them that they can then go and take a class on that time period and pass it.
Teach it.
Right. They're not promising them anything. But there are degrees of using that medium to do really, really wonderful work, I think.
What I want to develop more with this
Yeah.
thesis. Did you want to finish up?
Sure. Just to add to Monica, it seems like perhaps you're concerned about films deceiving people as to history, right? That something like Gladiator patently misrepresenting history is somehow...
It's more of a philosophical question than a moral one.
Okay. But if we are thinking of perhaps there are discrete elements of a film, a fictional film, that are historical, even if vast portions of it are not, that still requires something on the part of the audience, some discretion on the audience member in order to distinguish between what is and what isn't, in order to tease out what's useful history in this fiction film and what is not. And that it assumes expertise that most people probably
Yeah.
don't have.
I want to add a layer to this this thesis. Instead of just saying that there's a problem using film to present history, I would like to just compare it with the written word, the kind of history that can be portrayed with a good writer as compared with a good filmmaker, right? Robin Lane Fox, who is a great ancient historian, he was the person who was used to do that horrible movie Alexander the Great about 8 years ago. And he writes incredible books, incredible scholars. The movie was horrible. And I forgot who did the movie. He's great.
I think it was Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone, a great filmmaker. It was a rotten movie. But I want to make sure that we're comparing this with classic expressions of history, scholarship, the written word. Now, going back to this historical fiction genre, do you think that a historical fiction in a novel form is more historical than historical fiction on the screen? Is that a different ontological level? Is that a different?
I can't say that I read much historical fiction. I would say that they probably have the same pitfalls and problematic elements. Although one example comes to mind is Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City,
Yeah.
which is a
Classic.
bizarre case because I don't consider it historical fiction, but I don't consider it history either. But it's something that uses, an extensive amount of research and then injects it into a narrative, even though he writes about things that presumably no one could know, such as subjective points of view from characters and whatnot. And so is that acceptable to you as history? Because I also find myself feeling like I need to be able to tease out what is the history and what is not in this. And if I would cite it in some sort of paper, I would be very careful about what elements from that text that I actually use.
Well, I can actually think of one particular movie that obviously started out as a book, and unfortunately I have never read the book because the book is very, very long, and I'll get around to it someday. But the movie is exceptional, and I think it says something if you watch it about the time period in which it's coming from, and that's Dr. Zhivago. That movie is an epic. It's beautiful. It stars Omar Sharif, who is very attractive in my opinion, and it says something about socially, the desperation, the humanity, the transition of the people within Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution and how they adapt and deal with it. And so I think that that's probably an entirely different, theme, is adapting a historical fiction to film, or that's a book, and then adapting it to film and actually making it work. And
Yeah.
it does work very well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
that's a
think,
good- that's a
I mean,
great point.
besides the fact that, it's obviously not historically founded, it's a work of fiction, but it is really good for conveying that
Well, one thing that we
era,
and I think what
or
you're
how people might have dealt with that era.
right. One thing that I think you're getting at, and what we talked about before, Adam has his R.G. Collingwood book here, and Collingwood emphasizes quite a bit trying to get inside the mind of the historical actor, trying to be able to get a glimpse at what they might be thinking. And I think movies like that, and I'm going to cite one at the end, can do that. I think movies can do that with good dialogue to get you to think what it might have been like that. And I think that's valuable history. So, yeah, let's talk about that more like later when we get to our recommending movies. Go ahead.
So wait, was your last comment referring to, say, Dr. Zhivago as history or as a historical artifact that we can study to tell us something about?
Being able to convey some valid history.
Okay, all right.
But look,
This last series of comments made me think of a distinction maybe that we might make between narrative film and academic history, and it seems to me like we're pushing towards this issue of performing history versus narrating history, and that somehow narrating history, because presumably it entails some amount of research rather than simply embodying a persona that may or may not be accurate, that narrating history also entails having this pretense of being outside of history, that you are removed from these events, whereas when we see a fictional film or a literary historical fiction, there's this sense of immersion within a historical moment, and that immersion then leads to exaggeration and to all sorts of oversimplification.
what do you mean by immersion?
Well, when you engage with a narrative
From a film?
as an audience member or a reader of a book, when you are
And I want to make a distinction being immersed by words into a narrative and being immersed into a narrative via film. To me, I think those are two different qualities. I would say that the immersion can happen so wonderfully in words, but there's something about the film as representation, as so removed of reality and from the mind, that it makes it difficult to do that. When we discussed this before the show, the example in that book of the guy, he was talking about a documentary on Native American religion, and he eloquently put it how impossible it was to experience anything of that culture, even shots of the beautiful mountains. There was no aura there. You couldn't pick up the aura. Even if you said That is beautiful. That beauty would be, your remark would be referring to the image and not the real thing. There's just these symbols remove us so far from reality, whereas words have this ability to be vehicles, if you will, to really bring us into a different area.
See, I found myself disagreeing with that article, and which was, again, what was the author? Jerry Manders, Four
Yeah.
Arguments for the Elimination of Television.
Yeah.
It seemed as if Mander was simply responding to a poorly made text and representing some sort of landscape, some sort of ceremony. I think requires a visual medium, but it requires a well-made presentation rather than this poorly edited and poorly shot piece that he was responding to. And
Yeah, fair enough. I thought because the book is really a knock on the technology of television and how it does
at the
remove
time
us.
of the late 70s, which
Yes,
predates,
Yes.
the not just the current convergence era, but the multi-channel era of cable.
Right.
I wanted to go back for a brief moment just because I feel like this point needs to be made. And I think for people who are maybe suspicious of visual mediums such as television, such as film, there's an impulse to configure audiences as passive members, that you're simply receiving what is being projected into your brain through your eyeballs or your ears. And I very much disagree with that. Through, say, something like the film studies program at UWM, which I've been heavily involved in, one of the first things we teach our students is that you are not a passive viewer, you're not a passive audience member, you are reading an image. It's just a different form of reading than you would a text or a passage. So there's a wealth of visual information on the screen, and you can pay attention to different moments. And that's why for quality text, quality films, it's necessary to revisit them because you will continually uncover new elements, new information within that image and text, just as you would in a book. You constantly, right? You don't just read a book and put it down. If it's a valuable book for your research, you constantly return to it, find new meanings within the same passage, perhaps.
So you believe those images have the same amount of quality content as a good text?
Yes, I believe high quality ones do.
Okay.
Again, I think as we're talking about distinguishing academic history from narrative, fictional filmic representations of history, sure, you're not going to get a similar amount of actual historical information you can use, but certainly, if we say talk about a documentary, for instance, that might offer a different experience, different mode of interacting with history that I would argue could be more insightful than certain written versions. So I don't know if this is jumping ahead or not, but perhaps we could spend some time talking about other modes of film representation.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, if I could just interject in here, I think that we might be making setting up a dichotomy here that might not exist here as well. Maybe just kind of bouncing off of your point here. I think that just like a filmmaker, sets up a shot, right, to tell a story. I think that an author, just though it's written words, they're also painting a picture with their words. They're also establishing their own image, and I think that there might be, and just
they're both constructed texts.
They're both constructed texts. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that, and as you had mentioned, the viewer is the participant in this. In watching a film, as they are just like reading a text, right? So the imagery, there is still imagery going on here, and I think that the person reading it, the imagery that they see in their mind, I think that there's a lot left to imagination. Just the same way that somebody watching a film might, like, certain imagery might strike a chord and kind of play off of imagination and thoughts and perhaps memories. Written text does the exact same thing, right? We're left more to our imagination. It's not there for us, perhaps visually, but it's still there. I think that it plays off of a very similar kind of construction.
But don't you think if the goal for us, and going off of Collingwood again, if the goal is for the historian is partly at least, if not mostly, to get inside the thoughts of the historical actor, however that's possible, why don't words convey that? Why don't words take us there more accurately, more easily than visual images?
Words are still a form of mediation. There's still something coming between the action and the description of it. Someone, even representing their own thoughts. A word is just a sign. It's an arbitrary
Right.
signifier of that we've agreed upon that means something,
But,
right?
but it doesn't seem fair that even though they're both signs, doesn't mean they have the same quality with regard to certain. And they both have their strengths and their weaknesses with regard to what they can convey. But they're not. Certainly, they're not equal. And I guess what I'm saying is, in this case, words seem to be a stronger medium, a stronger, at least in certain cases.
Stronger
Then-
for representing history? Is that what
For
you're saying?
conveying history and conveying the information, conveying the human experience.
Yeah, and see, as Adam was saying, pictures and words are read differently, and they're quite literally read differently. You read a text left to right, top to bottom, right? That's how we read. When we look at a picture, we're looking at visual cues. We look straight at the picture, and however that picture just, happens to be set up, whether or not there's a central focus or there's something in the background or something's blurred, our eyes are making sense of that visual representation. We have cues as human beings. Innately, we know what certain things mean. And I think that that's really represented. For instance, visual culture exists for a reason. Look at someone like Cindy Sherman. How do you look at a representation, a picture of hers or a photograph of hers that she's made that is representing a facet of culture, and we kind of intimately know what she's getting at. It's very bizarre. It's kind of creepy. Another case in point is I went to the Wild Space Dance Company's program last week called Wild Night. This is all modern dance and other improvisation, and you have a sense of what's going on there, and they're not saying anything. And sometimes the dance doesn't even require music, and you can understand by their movements what they're trying to tell you. So I think that visual representation and literature, it's two separate things that we use to make sense of the world, and that there are even degrees of the way we write. We use prose, or we use poetry, or we use short form or whatever. It's never just a block sentence, and sometimes
Yeah.
a block sentence, a factual, literal sentence, can't convey exactly what we want.
Certainly agreed. I'm just saying that I think they both have their strengths and weaknesses for conveying different types of information. I mean,
Well, I think that perhaps part of this comes from the fact that academic historians are not trained to make films, unless they're actually in a program that emphasizes documentary history.
Though many documentarians do have
That is
history
true.
backgrounds.
That is true.
But again, we haven't
but
broached that field of
We haven't got
film
there
yet.
Right, but that's not. Yeah, I mean, and that's certainly not the norm, right? I think that as far as academic historians go, right, and actually, we're not even really trained how to write well. We're trained how to write like
second.
academic historians, right? Which is not necessarily accessible, and I think
No.
that there might be a distinction. Or there might be a distinction that could be made here.
yeah.
And I think,
Yeah. Sorry.
with your example of that Mander critiqued of this ritual and ceremony, losing something through the television medium. Again, I just have to believe that it's the fault of this program, and I couldn't imagine a written description of such a ceremony or ritual exceeding a well-made visual one. If we're talking about losing an aura, nothing loses it less than an objective description of movements without the visual accompaniment, right?
But a
Right.
But
It
a
makes
poetic
rituals
one.
sound sort of absurd when you read this is what people are doing here and here and here. Any sort of ritual.
Can film give us the experience of space that a human being would have, the understanding of the environment morality, cultural norms, the subtleties of religion?
I believe it can, yes. A film like Gladiator, perhaps not. But that's why I think, for the sake of time, is it okay if we move on? Because
yes.
comparing, these mainstream narrative films to history is really sort of a false comparison, I would say. Then
Well, we're
it's
just
really
starting.
more of a relationship to novels. So if we're saying
Yes.
filmmakers don't have historical background, well, novelists, to varying degrees, may or may not either.
Well, Jacob, we need a part 2 to this, so we need to come back another time to finish this. But yeah, let's get back. Let's go to this next section that we really wanted to, and that is film as an actual artifact, something that
Right.
someone can study the film itself and gain information about culture. This is something that you work with in your dissertation, in what you teach, all that. So let us know about that.
Sure. Without going too far afield, the film and culture sort of course that I've designed is about ways in which the Midwest has been represented over time, and I don't teach it as if these representations are accurate per se. I teach them as reflecting cultural attitudes about the region. So, how the region is understood in American culture is reflected through these films in some way or another. Perhaps maybe a way that we can all access this conversation is to think about World War II films, right? World War II films always have certain conventions, and I can't, and this might just be my, limited viewing experience, but I can't think of a single film, American film, depicting that era that in any way paints Americans anything other than heroic, right? As this generation that is sacrificing itself. This is an American, I say myth, and I don't mean that it's false, but this is an American myth that is ingrained into our culture, that this is the heroic generation we can all fall back on. And I feel like the necessity of those films as artifacts is that they give us all some sense of rightness and validation to fall back on as Americans, given the perhaps dubious military conflicts in the ensuing 70 years, right? We can say at this moment we were right
Yeah.
to invade, and these fictional texts, uphold that sense of rightness. And so it just gives us this entitlement almost.
But you work with horror.
Yes.
Now, how does
I
that
do.
work?
Well, actually, I have a passage here that I'd like to read
Yes,
in
please.
terms of horror. One of the other courses that I teach, and both my Midwest course and the horror course, I've taught on 3 separate occasions apiece. So I just want to read this brief passage from The Horror Genre, from Beelzebub to Blair Witch by Paul Wells. It's a very slim introductory volume to film. And so the very first paragraph of this text states, quote, "The history of the horror film is essentially a history of anxiety in the 20th century, in the way that fairy tales, folk tales, and gothic romances articulated the fears of the old world. The contemporary horror film has defined and illustrated the phobias of a new world characterized by a rationale of industrial, technological, and economic determinism. Arguably, more than any other genre, it has interrogated the deep-seated effects of change and responded to the newly determined grand narratives of social, scientific, and philosophical thought." So when I teach this course, I begin with silent films from the 19s, and we talk about some of the ways in which these films are very much engaged with, as this passage ends up, the social, scientific, and philosophical thought of the era. That means, at least in cursory ways, bringing up figures such as Darwin and Nietzsche and Marx and Freud, these figures who've had a substantial impact on human culture and thinking from the late 19th century or mid 19th century forward. And somehow these philosophical viewpoints on human experience are filtered into these fantastical films. So these films, in fact, are artifacts. They're, as I like to put it, an erstwhile history that we can use to accentuate, to supplement academic histories. Because instead of, and not that I'm accusing academic histories of just falling back on the sort of great man type of
Sure.
narrative, but they necessarily have to hit the high points of history, the big conflicts. Something like horror can reveal the everyday existences, the everyday concerns and fears and preoccupations of people from a certain era, if you're in tune to read them in some way, and if you come into them with a historical background.
Sure.
So that's my job as the teacher, is to provide students who may not have that sort of experience with, okay, here are things that's going on. You know, urbanization is a major issue at this point. So there's something strange about, you know, city dwellers being invaded by these mythical past figures like Dracula. You know, what is this about this, you know, changing moment in history that makes people preoccupied with somehow losing something of themselves to some naturally occurring force? So it's a metaphorical history, you know, something that's allegorical. But I think it's still valid as history, just a different type of history than what we've been
it
talking
sounds
about.
not unlike what one would do in art history, right? Where you're looking at the styles that are changing and you're tying them to changes within culture, whether they're intellectual, but you know, whatever would change culture, right?
Absolutely. You have to look at the subtext of whatever it is that you're looking at, because a painting's not going to, obviously, as we were talking about before, tell you, you know, word by word, literally, what it's trying to convey to you. And there's something about that painting or photograph or film that reflects part of, you know, whether it's the part of society or politics or whatever, you know.
So
And sorry.
So are
Go
you?
on.
So is it possible then that Gladiator maybe become more valuable for history 50 years from now when someone studies as an artifact than it would conveying what it wanted to convey?
Right, yes. I think it would say something about the turn of the 21st century culture more so than Roman culture. Something about a need for this myth, this great man myth all of a sudden. Like, why does he come at this era? Well, it's conjecture at this point, but we might see broader trends down the road. You know, say in horror at least, if we're looking at contemporary examples, recent trends have dealt with technological anxieties, have dealt with home invasion anxieties, and the sort of ugly stepbrother sort of genre of torture porn, this opening up of bodies on screen. Well, what have we had going on recently? An expansion of personal electronic devices that change the way we interact. We've had this major historical event of September 11th, which it's a bit of a cliche to refer to things as post 9/11, but we still see horror being preoccupied with breaking down barriers of domestic spaces over and over again in the last 10 years. So there's this reaction to historical events in these patently fiction films.
Sorry, I have to cut you short there. I want to get to this last section where we talk about, we can recommend some films that speak to what we've been talking about, because I think that would be very helpful. And I could remind our listeners that they're all available here for rent at River West Video. Joe, did you have some that you wanted to recommend just for any historical reasons, good or bad?
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. I think that the first one that comes to mind that kind of fits our earlier discussion about the material culture that's kind of portrayed in film, and making sure that some of it is accurate, right, is A Bridge Too Far, actually. And it's another war film. Seems to be a lot of war films out there. But this is one, and it was filmed in the, I want to say, late 60s, early 70s, early enough, or close enough to the war itself, that they were actually able to get the actual machines and a lot of the artifacts and like particularly the planes, and actually be able to fly them, which is very, very interesting. And they actually did get a big group of the planes that they could jump out of, which is kind of fascinating. It's kind of a fascinating artifact in and of itself, and a pretty stellar cast with James Caan and Michael Caine. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyways, and then probably a good one too that I'd like to suggest that kind of does kind of go into some of the banalities of perhaps everyday life, but then also does document a pretty significant moment, is The Wind That Shakes the Barley. Yeah, which is pretty phenomenal, and it does kind of center around the construction of the Irish Free State.
Right.
I want to do some quick ones. Reds. I like the movie Reds. I would recommend Reds by Warren Beatty because in the movie he recognizes the things that I'm trying to get at, the difficulty of portraying history in film, and he gets around it. He gets around all of this by bringing in witnesses and interviewing them. So he has people actually talking about the person that he's doing this movie about. It brings a lot of depth to the movie. It's a wonderful movie. There are cliches in the movie. There's some, especially around the romance. But I think it's a great movie, and I think Warren Beatty does a great job of trying to get around some of those difficulties. Secondly, the Last Days of Sophie Scholl is a German movie. It's about the White Rose Resistance, and what is great about it is the dialogue that occurs between her after she's captured and her interrogator. The dialogue is so exceptional that I would say that it literally allows you to get below the surface and have some sort of understanding of what it's like to resist a totalitarian regime. I think we get into telling us some intellectual history. And then lastly, only because it tells us the value of history for the individual person in their life, is a movie called Everything is Illuminated. It's Everything is Illuminated, ... and at the end they tell you what illuminates it. So those three.
It's in Jonathan Safran Foer adaptation, correct?
Yeah.
I would add, as one that I feel holds up without qualification as history, it's a documentary called Standard Operating Procedure. It's by the filmmaker Errol Morris, who in fact does have a history background. He's been making documentary films for the past 30 plus years. Standard Operating Procedure deals with the Abu Ghraib incidents, but it's not some sort of agitprop. It's a film that blends the actual documents, it blends interviews with the people who are involved in the situation, and it does not feature any narration or direction for the audience member. It presents the evidence to you, and in a sense, lets you play the role of historian. You see what a historian might use, and you can take away from it what you want. So I've taught this film in a course, and I've had a wonderful reaction. Students love to talk about it, and because that historical event is so much based on images, right? That's why it's necessary to be depicted through images. The other thing, briefly, is I would recommend taking a look at some Italian neorealist films from the 1940s. It's a film movement that began even during World War II, as Italy was under attack. And while they feature melodramatic narratives, they're set in the actual environments that are being bombarded. And so you get the sense from filmmakers like Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini of a real sense of place. So those films are certainly ones that would be valuable as historical artifacts, that you get an environment that can't be replicated and recreated elsewhere.
Monica, you have 10 seconds.
Yes, I am going to skip the part about the movies, and I just want to give a plug for the actual oral digital history that we're doing through the architecture department, the Buildings, Landscapes, Culture Field School this summer, which will turn into a documentary. So if you want to see history and documentary film at work, and also collections of oral interviews online, go to Picturing Milwaukee. So, and if you just Google Picturing Milwaukee or BLC Field School, it will come up. But I suggest you check it out.
Okay, great. Thanks, you guys. This was a wonderful conversation. We just scratched the surface. I can tell we didn't even get into documentaries.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob, for allowing me to do this. And see you next week.
Thank you for letting me be a guest on your show.
My pleasure.
Thank you.